Wow, okay, we actually,
I gave the really good.
it's working.
Good job, right?
Crazy, that's wild.
All right, fantastic, thank you.
All right.
Okay, yeah, that's me, yeah. Aristotle, what a guy, am I right? Chapter 1 of book 9, he offers, it's about friendship, he's continuing that. He offers several examples and explanations of kind of like instances where a friendship is not made of mutual effort and or motivation. So for example, he mentions a friendship of lovers, which one person feels like they aren't receiving the amount of love that they put into the relationship, or that maybe someone feels like the other, quote, who promised everything now performs nothing, and that's 1164, line 5-ish. Right, so an example, a relationship that's not seemingly mutual and equal. And Aristotle's response to these kind of scenarios is that these are situations that are results of when, quote, the lover loves the beloved for the sake of pleasure, while the beloved loves the lover for the sake of utility. That's around line 7. So in other words, it's when the motivation for the relationship is different between the people involved. And this kind of ties back to Aristotle's emphasis on the importance of virtue in perfect friendships, right? Because if both people are virtuous and you love the other for their virtue, I think he says that near line 15, or no, not them. Oops, where's that quote? Awesome. Right here. So for each did not love the other person himself, but the qualities he had. So again, it's the idea that love of character is more stable and long-lasting than just pleasure or utility. And then that leads him to kind of talk about the importance of being able to get what you would like out of a relationship. Because he says, when you don't get what you intended out of a relationship, it is like getting nothing at all when we do not get what we aim at. So he sort of goes to less of friendships in the conventional sense and just more of interactions with people, wanting to get what you are intending to get out of that interaction, right? And that goes into chapter 2, which I really did not understand all that well, but I'll do my best to explain it. So he begins chapter 2, which is about the conflict of obligations. And he talks about kind of, he says that there's specific people with specific skills that you would want for specific services, right? Like a doctor to treat when one is ill, or a man of military skill for matters of war, right? And that seems kind of straightforward to me. But then he says, around 1164, towards the end of 1164b, all such questions are hard, are they not, to decide with precision. And I did not know what he meant by that. I don't know what question he's referring to. Like, is he saying that it's hard to know that you need a doctor for medical help rather than your dad or a general? Like, that to me doesn't make sense. So if anyone has a better interpretation, please let me know, because I did not get that. But that just sort of goes into his point of getting the right service from the right person. And then he continues from there to talk about how you generally don't want to be in debt, or you don't want to oblige a friend, right? It's better to, quote, pay back a loan to a creditor rather than to make one to a friend. So this idea that it's typically not good to obligate your friends. And that's kind of it for what I have.
Can I leap in here for just a second? So this chapter 2 is actually Thank you for your summary.
Yeah.
But is what it talks about is the as Towns noted, the conflicts of obligations. What happens when we feel an obligation to more than one person in a given situation, right? How do we resolve, for example, an obligation to one's immediate family, a father or a brother? How do we, if they're competing obligations to one's kinship group or community and so on? And I hasten to add that this is exactly what's happening in our country today, right? The obligations. What are our obligations? The last 2 weeks there have been impeachment hearings. What are the obligations? What do these people making the decisions, to whom are they obligated? One side says the obligation is the party, for example. One group would say the obligation is the party, or to a person. Others would say, no, it's to a political ideal or something else. So this is a perfect example of when there are conflicting obligations, how do we resolve them? And Aristotle says, well, depends. Depends on a lot of things, right? Depends on one situation. Depends on whether it's a brother or a father or just a member of the community or a member of one kinship group. Those all have a varying degree of obligations on one, right? So this is a very difficult thing, and Aristotle says, well, it depends on the situation, right? How do we adjudicate? How do we determine what is going to be good? And ultimately, he says that the ultimate end in adjudicating a situation of conflicting obligations is the welfare of the community. And this is where we're going to get into the politics. No one can achieve this state of eudaimonia in a dysfunctional community. That's impossible. So at the end of the day, the demands or the obligations towards the welfare of the community supersede those that have to do with the obligations to one's father, one's brother, or anything else. That has to be a consideration, because without a functioning society, none of us as individuals can achieve a degree of eudaimonia. So sorry to interject, but this chapter happens to be right now a huge issue politically, and it doesn't matter where you stand on the political spectrum. This is a perfect example of the conflicts of obligation. So sorry, Dan.
No problem. All right.
Okay, so
Wait, Roma, you.
Yeah, can I add on to that? I just thought this is something that I noted in that little passage that he was talking about in chapter 2. I thought it was significant how it said that we should help our parents before all others because we owe them our nourishment. And then I thought that respecting, it says to all older people. I highlighted that you should rise to receive them and find seats for them and so on. And then I just highlighted that because it's kind of funny to see that in my high school where I came from, like we have that still, like when another faculty member walks in or a guest walks in who's an adult, we all have to stand up. So it's kind of, I saw that in play in my high school, and that's why I highlighted it. So that's the only thing I wanted to add.
So Aristotle starts off chapter 3 by asking if we should break off friendships if the relationship has changed over time. So sometimes in friendships, one person kind of takes advantage of the other person, but the other person who's being taken advantage of may think that they're in a true friendship, and Aristotle says it's their fault for believing that they were friends in the first place, and they should have known that they were being taken advantage of. And he also explains how, like, the best way to deal with this situation is to, like, kind of reform the friendship and, like, trying to move closer to a true friendship where one isn't being like taken advantage of, and but like another like rational decision is just to completely like end the friendship as a whole. And then he also brings up a point about having a friend that is more virtuous than the other. And he says if there's too big of a virtue, or if one friend is more like too much more virtuous than the other, like it like they can't really be friends because they share different pains and pleasures. And he brings up the example of one friend becoming a man, like while the other stays a child, and he just says that they can't really relate because they have different interests. And then in chapter 4, he starts by comparing a mother who wishes the best for her children and takes care of them to a person, to a good person who wishes for the best for himself and does, or I guess takes care of themselves in order to honor his rational soul. So, and he says a friend should be like your second self, which basically means that you should also wish the best for your friends and take care of your friends in the same way. And I guess he kind of says that you should love yourself in moderation, because being corrupt, or you can become corrupt if you love yourself too much, because you only care about yourself and you don't really wish the best for your friends, and then if you don't love yourself enough, I guess you don't really know how to love other people.
All right, Roma.
All right. So chapter 5 is about goodwill, and so the notes that I picked up in chapter 5 was that goodwill does not, it's not the same thing as a friendship, because friendship needs intimacy and goodwill can be spontaneous. But goodwill, if people keep making effort and if goodwill is prolonged, then it can be a sign of a friendship to come. And it says in chapter 5 that people cannot be friends. Okay, it says in 1167A, around line 8, it says it is not possible for people to be friends if they have not come to feel goodwill for each other. So you have to mutually feel goodwill for your pals. And and then I already said if goodwill is prolonged, then it leads to intimacy, then you have a friendship. And then chapter 6 is about concord. And concord is characteristic of friendship, but it seems to be more of a political friendship, because in 1167B, line 2, it says, for it is concerned with things that are to our interest and have influence on our life, and it's found among good men. And so bad men cannot have concord because they always try to get more of a benefit without putting in work. And so it has to be mutually between people. And that was similar to how in order to have a friendship, it's more ideal if both of the people are good, and if they're good, then they're also virtuous. And that was from one of the other readings that we had previously, and I'm sorry I didn't make the note of that, but I did flip back and look at it. And then chapter 7, it is beneficence. beneficence. And I said that when beneficence is an action, then it is closer to a friendship. But when it has to do with money, then it is not symbolic of a friendship. Because let me see. It says in 1167b, it says those who have done a service to others feel friendship and love for those they have served, even if those are not of any use to them and never will be. And so this was different than the goodwill because, well, it was similar to the goodwill because goodwill you can just do something, it doesn't have to lead to a friendship, but if they have done a service and they feel friendship, then it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a friendship because the goodwill has to be going both ways. And so I feel like the same thing applies with beneficence.
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 Very good.
Okay, so chapter 8 is about the nature of true self-love, and the chapter begins by having Aristotle question or ask whether people should love themselves more than others, and then proceeds to say that those people that do love themselves more than others kind of get a bad rap for it, and then goes on to explain that people only think of themselves while good people are selfless, and he says that in 1168a, lines 33 through 35. And then on 1168b, line 10, he says he is his own best friend and therefore ought to love himself best. So that kind of connects back to what I was saying about wanting to care for your friends and hope that they prosper in a similar way that you do. In a way, you are your own best friend, so you should be able to see yourself prosper and hope that you prosper. So that's kind of his justification for saying, yes, you should care for yourself and you should love yourself because you want to see yourself prosper. Then goes on to talk about how you can have too much self-love. 68, the 14 through 19, he says that if self-lovers are too selfish and grab for more than their fair share of love, or they love themselves too much and don't care enough about others, then that's not okay. So there is moderation in that needs to be taken into account. However, one who truly loves himself will always be noble in his actions and aim for good, and that's 1168b, 29 through 31. And Aristotle says that everyone acted in such a noble way, everything would be as it should be, and that's on lines 8 through 10 on 1169a. And a little bit further down on 1169a 23, he talks about how a truly good person gains pleasure in sacrificing for others and helping others benefit. And on 1169a 34, kind of closes by saying that many people would give up doing noble things if it means that their friend would also do noble things. So again, that kind of connects back to what my brother was saying, that you want your friends to prosper, and that you should care for them in a similar way that you care for yourself. All right, thank you, Rob.
All right, chapter 9. Aristotle talks about the need of friendship. Like, why does a happy man need friendship? Well, basically because I don't think the happy man can actually be happy in solitary. He goes on to say in line 15, he talks about not only does the man in adversity need people to confer benefits with, but also those who are prospering need people to confer with. So that just lets me know that for a man to truly be happy, he needs to be, social. And the people that he hang around have to share something in common with him for them to be, closer friends. You know what I'm saying? You're not going to be close friends with someone who's have nothing in common with. you're going to be friends with someone. Your best friend is probably the one who has the most common with you, right? So, and happy man has to have happy friends for, you know, so they can have things in common and to have things to conversate about. Also, we talk about what is good in nature is also good for the virtuous man, which is the reason why life seems pleasant to all men. So that lets me know why I feel a certain way when I look outside and see, you know, a beautiful tree changing colors. I tied that part down. So yeah, it's basically that in order for a happy man to be happy, he needs happy friends. And for a happy man to be happy, he needs friends. Period. That's basically what I got from that. Anybody have any questions?
Can I add something here, this really quick on this particular point? And that is, I mean, I think what just a little footnote on Tank's concept is that, yes, this gets to the issue of self-sufficiency. It should be possible, theoretically, for one to achieve eudaimonia, this state of happiness, by oneself, right? Theoretically, that ought to be the case. And Aristotle here does make a distinction. He says, yes, it's possible, but the highest good, the highest form of friendship requires, the highest form of happiness, eudaimonia in its highest form, requires friendships. Okay, so it is possible to achieve eudaimonia, but it's more difficult, and it doesn't have the same benefits. It doesn't provide the same sort of pleasures that the higher form of friendship, or the higher form of happiness that is dependent upon friendship provides. So Aristotle sort of makes a distinction here. Yes, one can be happy without friends. It's more difficult. And ultimately, the highest form of happiness comes to us through friendship.
So, chapter 10 is about the limit to the number of friends. So essentially, so I was talking about, asked the question of whether should a man neither be friendless nor have an excessive number of friends. And when asking this question, basically, what he ends up deciding is that we should both limit our number of good friends for both quality and compatibility purposes. And he kind of goes into this through a couple different reasons. But one of the quotes that I really liked that he says at the beginning is of friends made with a view to pleasure.
Where are you? Give us a
on,
citation here.
I'm in line 27.
Okay, we need a 4-digit number.
4-digit number. I am 1170B.
Very good, thank you.
And he says, of friends made with a view to pleasure, also few are enough, as little seasoning in food as is enough. And from there he kind of goes into talking about making the comparison with like good friends to having a city. He's saying like you can't have a city of 10 men, but you can't have a city with 100,000, and because that doesn't count. And he goes into basically saying that that another quote I like, he says, presumably then it is well not to seek to have as many friends as possible, but as many as are enough for the purpose of living together. For it would seem actually impossible to be a great friend to many people. So he's kind of going over quality over quantity purposes in terms of talking about friends. He also talks about how it's too difficult to kind of rejoice and grieve with friends, and in that way he says that there's a fixed number of friends you should have, you can't actually define what that fixed number is. It's somewhere where in a range where it's not too many, not too little. Aristotle ends 10 by talking about how this is why you can't love several people, because love is ideally a sort of an excess of friendship that can only be felt towards one person. And then he says, therefore, great friendship can too only be felt towards a few people. So using that kind of to tie in there. And then going on to 11, Aristotle asks, are friends more needed in good or bad fortune? And Aristotle essentially says both. While he talks about like the very presence of friends is pleasant, both in good fortune and it can be also in bad. When your friends are sad, you grieve with them, and that affects you too. So it can be very painful to see a friend share, and you have to share their burden with them, basically. Additionally, like you don't like being a pain to your friend, you don't like causing them pain. So it's tough being with them in that situation. And then he also he ends, basically he goes through that in a couple different ways, and then he ends 11 by saying that the presence of friends, although they can kind of cause you pain as well, they're desirable in all circumstances. And that's his last line.
All right, Tim. So you can go ahead. I guess is it okay. Just like next time you have class.
Yeah, we'll come back to.
Next time you have class, that you can speak then. So, Dan.
So chapter 3 of book 10, Aristotle talks about the view that the pleasure is fully bad, and he argues against it. He starts out by saying that he starts out by wanting to argue with people who say that the good is determinate and while pleasure is indeterminate. He says that virtues can certainly appear in people to greater or lesser degrees, and while pleasure has degrees, that doesn't mean that it isn't defined. Like in line 1173a 74, just asks how limits of degrees without being indeterminate, why should not pleasure? And then he says that the people also said that the good, the pleasure, the good is a complete thing, but pleasure is motion or process. And once again, Aristotle argues against it by saying that if pleasure were a motion, then it will be subject to speed, and one can't really feel pleasure quickly or slowly, which I agree. He then moves on to argues about against pleasure being a process of coming into being. He says that because it doesn't have the process of depletion and replenishment of things, that pleasure shouldn't be like process of coming into being sort. Down, Aristotle says that disgraceful pleasures are not at all pleasant, and that they will only be like pleasant to people of vicious constitution, and not like pleasant to others. He says that just as in line 1173b 23, just as we do not reason so about the things that are wholesome or sweet of those who sick people, or ascribe blindness to things that seem white to those suffering from disease of the eye, that we should like associate disgraceful pleasures to like everyone. Moving down, he raises an analogy of a friend and a flatterer, and good implies pleasure. Says that a friend is the good thing, whereas a flatterer is just all about pleasure. Finally, he closes the chapter off with an argument saying that we should aim at many things, including virtues, even if they didn't give us pleasure, and that pleasure that neither is pleasure to give nor is all pleasure desirable.
Alright, great.
Yeah, so book 10, chapter 4 is the definition of pleasure. So Aristotle in this chapter gives multiple definitions and reasons for his definition of pleasure. The first being that pleasure is not for the sake of an end. On 1174a, he says, "For it is a whole, and at no time can one find a pleasure whose form will be completed, if the pleasure lasts longer. For this reason, too, it is not a movement. For every movement, for example, that of a building, takes time and is for the sake of an end." So as he says, like creating a building, there's a means to an end. You want that building to be complete. You want it to stand erect. Whereas pleasure has no end and has no reason for beginning in the first place. Next would be pleasure is unlike any other experience because it is not ever complete. On 1174b, Aristotle says, "But of pleasure, the form is complete at any and every time." Because that of a building, she said as an example again, there is, it is never complete. There you are always currently moving from point A to point B. But with pleasure in the time that it happens, it is always complete, it is always whole, and it's always one thing. On page, 1175a, Aristotle says that pleasure is produced in respect to each sense is plain, for we speak of sights and sounds as pleasant. It is also plain that it arises most of all when both the sense is at its best and it is active in reference to an object with course to which it corresponds. Aristotle's point is that at any given time, pleasure occurs because of its respect to a whole happiness and a whole pleasure. So, for example, an organ in your body, at its best, will cause pleasure throughout your whole body because in respect to the rest of your organs, it is active and healthy. And then lastly, why can we not always experience pleasure? Aristotle asks, how then is it that no one is continuously pleased? Is it that we grow weary? Certainly all human things are incapable of continuous activity, therefore pleasure also is not continuous. Being under the definition of an activity, like Aristotle says, we cannot always be continuous, therefore pleasure can also not always continue. And that's what I have.
So in chapter 5, he's kind of building on his definition of pleasure in the previous chapter. But he does so to differentiate between pleasure and activity. He starts off by saying pleasure and activity are separate, but pleasure will intensify the activity that you're undertaking, especially if you're fond of the activity. So if you like doing something, then you're going to be that much more engaged in the activity. Consequently, pleasure arising from outside sources hinders activities. So this is kind of his way of dealing with multitasking. So if you're trying to do two things at once, and you value one of the activities more than the other, then the other one's going to go to the wayside, and you're going to put most of your effort into the activity that you're fond of the most. He gives the example of a flute lover, and during an argument, so this person would be arguing about something, but then he hears the the playing of a flute, so he kind of diverts his attention to the thing he loves more. And then continuing, he says the worse one activity's pleasure is, the more we lean into the other. And he gives the example of if you're sitting in a theater watching, in his case it would be a play, not a movie, but and you also get snacks. If the movie isn't that good, you're gonna eat more of the food just to balance the pleasure out. Therefore, proper pains. Wait, hold on. Therefore, proper pains and alien pleasures have the same purpose. This means that, like, this part is a little kind of hard to understand, but a proper pain would be like something that hurts you, obviously, but an alien pleasure would be like the thing you're dealing with when the multitasking. So if, like, that secondary pleasure, or the thing that, like, diverts, like, your attention is going to be diverted from, it has the same effect as like a pain, because you're not really, like, engaged in that to the utmost degree. Since all activities result in a proper pleasure, pleasures like activities have a good, a bad, and a neutral. And just like there are superior activities, there are superior pleasures. And then to round it off, he says, pleasures vary from species to species. So, like, the pleasures that we get as humans are vastly different from the pleasures of, like, an animal or a plant per se. And then they especially vary within humanity from person to person. So, like, the things that make me happy or I can derive pleasure from are not going to be the same things as another person.
All right, Kylie.
Okay, so chapter 6 is about happiness, and he starts off by restating how happiness is what end of human affairs is stated to be, and how happiness must be placed among those desirable in themselves, for happiness is something that's self-sufficient. And then he goes on to talk about pleasant amusements, because it's not the same as happiness, and how pleasant amusements are harmful rather than beneficial, because they lead us to neglect our bodies and our properties, but happiness is a beneficial thing. And happiness is different for each individual, because different things are valuable to, like, for example, he talks about how boys value different things than men, and good men value different things than bad men, and how we should choose everything for the sake of something else except for happiness. Happiness, you shouldn't choose for the sake of something else, because it's self-sufficient. And then he talks about, in the beginning, in 1176a, the little subsection under happiness says happiness is good activity, not amusement. But amusement is still needed because it's a sort of relaxation. And you need relaxation because you cannot work continuously, because then happiness wouldn't be achieved. And how happy life is thought to be a virtuous thing. And then in chapter 7, it's about how the contemplative life is the happiest. And happiness is the ultimate thing, so it must be correlated with the best things and the best virtue. And the best virtues belong to the intellect, which goes along with having a contemplative life. And so the contemplative life will be the perfect happiness, because reason is the best thing in us. And Aristotle talks about how we should have pleasure, and how philosophic wisdom is the most virtuous pleasure that you could have, and self-sufficiency must belong to the contemplative activity. And in 1178a, line 5, he says, that which is proper to each saying is by nature best and most pleasant for each saying. For a man, therefore, the life according to reason is best and pleasantest, since reason more than anything else is man. And so he's saying that reason is man, and therefore the life of reason is also the happiest life we could have. And he goes on to talk about how we must make ourselves immortal and live in accordance with the best thing in us, which is reason. And yeah.
All right, do you want to keep going, or we have time?
Well, we're out of time. Okay, so this is our last meeting until till next Monday, so a week from today. And so let's continue on our discussion a little bit. There will be a reading assignment, but we'll